Welcome to Midnight and Murder, a true crime series for sleeping, where true crime meets calm and mystery meets the mind at rest. Let's go. Story 1, The Collector. The rain drummed against the windows of the Millbrook police station as Detective Sarah Chen stared at the evidence board that had consumed her thoughts for the past 6 months. 3 photographs stared back at her. 3 separate crime scenes, 3 different victims, but one chilling connection that made her blood run cold. It began on a Tuesday morning in October when Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell failed to show up for her weekly bridge game. At 73, Eleanor was punctual to a fault, never missing an appointment without calling ahead. When her concerned friends knocked on her door at 42 Maple Street, they found it unlocked, unusual for a woman who had lived alone since her husband's death 5 years prior. The house felt different somehow, though nothing appeared to be missing. Eleanor's purse sat on the kitchen counter, her reading glasses folded neatly beside yesterday's newspaper. Her bed was made with military precision, just as she did every morning for the past 50 years. But Eleanor was gone. Officer Martinez was the first to notice the peculiarity. In Eleanor's living room, where family photographs had covered the mantelpiece for decades, now sat a single white lily in a crystal vase. The photographs were gone, not stolen, but carefully removed and stacked face down in a neat pile on the coffee table. It was as if someone had methodically erased every trace of Eleanor's family from view. Why would someone take the time to do this? Martinez had asked, photographing the scene. Burglars don't rearrange furniture. Detective Chen arrived within the hour, her trained eye immediately drawn to the lily. Fresh cut, expensive, not the type of flower Eleanor would have bought for herself. The stems were cut at precisely the same angle, suggesting professional florist work. But what unsettled Chen most was the positioning, placed exactly in the center of the mantelpiece, as if marking a shrine. The search for Eleanor Hartwell consumed the next 3 days. Neighbors reported seeing her Tuesday morning, watering her garden, wearing her favorite blue cardigan. The mailman confirmed delivering her Social Security check at 10:15 a.m. But after that, Eleanor seemed to have vanished into thin air. It wasn't until the following weekend that hikers discovered her body in Millbrook Forest, 20 miles from her home. Eleanor sat peacefully against an oak tree, dressed in her blue cardigan, hands folded in her lap. To the untrained eye, she appeared to be sleeping. But Chen knew better. The medical examiner later confirmed Eleanor had died from a carefully administered dose of digitalis, a heart medication that, in larger quantities, could stop a heart within hours. What disturbed Chen most wasn't the murder itself, but the care taken with Eleanor's body. Her hair had been combed, her clothes straightened, her hands positioned just so. A single white lily lay across her lap, identical to the one found in her home. This wasn't a crime of passion or greed. This was something far more calculated. The second case came 6 weeks later. Robert Thornfield, a retired accountant who lived alone in a modest ranch house on the outskirts of town, failed to show up for his weekly grocery run. His neighbor, Mrs. Davidson, grew concerned when she noticed his newspapers piling up and his porch light burning continuously for 3 days straight. When police entered Robert's home, they found the same eerie scene. The house was immaculate, nothing appeared stolen, but every family photograph had been removed from the walls and shelves, stacked face down on the dining room table. In their place, a single white lily sat in a crystal vase on the kitchen windowsill. Robert's body was found 4 days later in the same forest, positioned against a different oak tree with the same careful attention to detail. The same peaceful expression, the same folded hands, the same single lily. The medical examiner confirmed identical cause of death, digitalis poisoning administered with surgical precision. Detective Chen spent sleepless nights studying the cases, searching for connections between Eleanor and Robert. They had lived in different neighborhoods, shopped at different stores, attended different churches. Eleanor was social and outgoing. Robert was a quiet loner. The only connection she could find was their age, both in their 70s, both living alone, both with grown children who lived far away. The third case shattered any remaining doubt that Millbrook had a serial killer. Margaret Sinclair, 75, lived in a Victorian house on Elm Street that she had inherited from her parents. A former librarian, Margaret was known for her extensive book collection and her habit of leaving her front door unlocked during the day, a practice from a bygone era when neighbors looked out for each other. On a Thursday morning in December, Margaret's weekly house cleaner, Rosa, arrived to find the front door ajar and Margaret nowhere to be found. The scene was becoming disturbingly familiar. Family photographs removed and stacked, personal mementos hidden from view, and a single white lily positioned prominently on Margaret's antique secretary desk. But this time the killer had made a mistake. Rosa noticed immediately that Margaret's prized possession, a first edition of Pride and Prejudice that she kept displayed in a glass case, was missing. Not hidden like the photographs, but actually stolen. Chen's team scoured local pawn shops, rare book dealers, and online auction sites. Within 48 hours, they had traced the book to a small antiquarian bookshop in the neighboring town of Riverside. The shop owner, Mr. Kowalski, remembered the seller distinctly. Middle-aged man, well-dressed, very polite, he told Chen, said he was cleaning out his deceased mother's house and needed to sell her books quickly. Paid cash, didn't haggle about the price. But it was the security camera footage that provided the breakthrough Chen had been waiting for. The timestamp showed 3:47 p.m. on the day Margaret disappeared. The man entering the shop was tall, approximately 6 feet, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a dark wool coat and carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being trusted. Chen recognized him immediately. Dr. James Morrison, a retired physician who had practiced in Millbrook for 30 years. A man who would have access to digitalis, who would know exactly how to administer it, who would have the medical knowledge to make death appear peaceful and natural. The investigation into Dr. Morrison revealed a man whose life had slowly unraveled over the past decade. His wife had died 8 years ago after a long battle with Alzheimer's disease. His 2 adult children lived across the country and rarely visited. His medical practice had been his identity, and retirement had left him feeling purposeless and forgotten. But it was Morrison's volunteer work that provided the final piece of the puzzle. For the past year, he had been volunteering with a local organization that provided companionship visits to elderly residents living alone. He had met Eleanor Hartwell during one of these visits. He had been Robert Thornfield's personal physician for 15 years. Margaret Sinclair had been his patient as well before his retirement. Chen obtained a search warrant for Morrison's home, a modest 2-story house where he had lived alone since his wife's death. What they found in his basement study made her understand the true horror of what they were dealing with. The walls were covered with photographs, not of Morrison's family, but of his victims. Pictures of Eleanor in her garden, Robert at the grocery store, Margaret walking to the library. But these weren't candid shots taken from a distance. These were carefully composed portraits, taken with the subject's knowledge and consent. Morrison had been visiting these people, earning their trust, documenting their lives. On Morrison's desk, Chen found a leather-bound journal filled with meticulous notes about each victim, their daily routines, their fears, their regrets about children who never called, grandchildren they rarely saw. Morrison had been collecting their stories, their loneliness, their quiet desperation. The journal's final entry, dated the day before Margaret's disappearance, read, "They are forgotten by the world, abandoned by their families, waiting alone for death. I give them dignity in their final moments. I ensure they are remembered. The lilies are for remembrance. The photographs are put away because family should not witness what family has allowed to happen." When Chen and her team arrived at Morrison's house to make the arrest, they found him sitting in his study, a white lily in his hands, a glass of water, and a small bottle of digitalis on the desk beside him. He looked up at her with the same peaceful expression she had seen on his victims' faces. "I gave them what their families never could," he said quietly. "I was with them at the end. They weren't alone." Dr. James Morrison died in the hospital 3 hours later. His suicide note, found in his jacket pocket, contained the locations of 2 more bodies, elderly victims from the neighboring county that police had been unable to connect to the Millbrook cases. The Midnight Collector, as the media dubbed him, had been operating for over a year. His victims weren't random. They were carefully selected from his pool of patients and volunteer visits. People who had confided in him their feelings of abandonment, their fear of dying alone, their anger at children who had moved away and forgotten them. Morrison's journal revealed his twisted logic. He believed he was performing a mercy, ensuring these forgotten souls died with dignity and companionship. The lilies were his signature, symbols of restored innocence and peace. The hidden photographs were his way of sparing the victims from seeing images of family members who, in his mind, had failed them. The case closed with Morrison's death, but the questions it raised lingered in Detective Chen's mind. In a society where elderly people increasingly lived alone, forgotten by busy families in disconnected communities, how many others might be vulnerable to someone who offered companionship with deadly intentions? The families of Eleanor Hartwell, Robert Thornfield, and Margaret Sinclair were devastated to learn how their loved ones had died. But perhaps more devastating was the knowledge that their final weeks had been spent confiding their loneliness to the very person who would ultimately end their lives. The Millbrook Police Department implemented new protocols for checking on elderly residents, and the local volunteer organization where Morrison had worked established background checks and supervision procedures. But for Detective Chen, the case served as a haunting reminder of how isolation and loneliness could be weaponized by those who understood the human need for connection. The white lilies Morrison left behind were eventually disposed of as evidence, but their meaning, remembrance of the forgotten, remained etched in the minds of everyone who worked the case. In the quiet moments before sleep, Chen often wondered how many other midnight collectors might be out there, identifying lonely souls and offering them the ultimate permanent solution to their isolation. The case files were sealed, the evidence stored, and life in Millbrook slowly returned to normal. But the story of the Midnight Collector became a cautionary tale about the dangers that can lurk behind the mask of compassion and the deadly consequences when society's most vulnerable are left to face their final days alone. Years later, when Chen reviewed the case for a training seminar, she would tell young detectives that the most chilling aspect wasn't the murders themselves, but the realization that Morrison's victims had welcomed him into their homes, trusted him with their fears, and found comfort in his presence right up until the moment he took their lives. The Midnight Collector had understood something fundamental about human nature, that the fear of being forgotten is often stronger than the fear of death itself. And in that understanding, he had found the perfect method to become the last person his victims would ever see, ensuring that he, not their families, would be their final memory of human connection. The case remains a stark reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators are not those who hunt in darkness, but those who offer light to people who have been living in shadow for far too long. Story 2, The Midnight Letters. In the quiet coastal town of Millbrook Harbor, where the sound of waves against weathered docks provided a constant, gentle rhythm, Detective Sarah Chen had grown accustomed to the predictable nature of small-town crime. Petty theft, the occasional bar fight, and noise complaints comprised the bulk of her caseload. That was until the letters began arriving. The first letter appeared on a Tuesday morning in October, slipped under the door of the Millbrook Harbor Police Station sometime between midnight and dawn. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive-looking, with no return address. Inside, written in precise, old-fashioned cursive, was a single page that would change everything. Detective Chen, you don't know me, but I know you. I know you drink 2 cups of coffee every morning, black, no sugar. I know you take the long way to work past the lighthouse because it reminds you of your grandmother. I know you're about to become very busy. The truth about Eleanor Whitmore's death isn't what you think. Look closer. A friend. Eleanor Whitmore had been the town librarian for 37 years before her death 6 months earlier. At 73, she had been found peacefully in her reading chair at home, surrounded by stacks of books, a cup of cold tea beside her. The coroner had ruled it natural causes, a heart attack. There had been no investigation, no questions asked. Eleanor had lived alone since her husband's death a decade prior, and while she had been beloved by the community, her passing had been seen as the gentle conclusion to a life well lived. Detective Chen read the letter 3 times before carefully placing it in an evidence bag. The handwriting was distinctive. Someone educated, possibly older, with training and penmanship that suggested a different era. The paper stock was high quality, the kind sold at only one shop in town, Hartwell's Stationery, an old-fashioned store that had served the community for generations. That afternoon, Chen visited Margaret Hartwell, the elderly proprietor of the stationery shop. Margaret's shop was a maze of fountain pens, leather-bound journals, and the scent of aged paper. When Chen showed her the letter, Margaret's eyes widened with recognition. Oh my, yes, that's our premium writing paper, Margaret said, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses. We only sell about 10 boxes a year. Most people use computers now, you know. But this handwriting, she paused, studying the letter more carefully. This looks like the Palmer method. They stopped teaching that in schools decades ago. Chen made a mental note to research who in town might have learned the Palmer method of handwriting. As she prepared to leave, Margaret called out, Detective, you might want to know. Someone's been buying quite a bit of this paper lately. Always pays cash, always comes in just before closing time. Can you describe them? Margaret shook her head. I've never gotten a good look. They wear a dark coat, hat pulled low, but they have a slight limp, favors the left leg. The second letter arrived exactly 1 week later, again slipped under the station door in the early morning hours. This time the message was more specific. Detective Chen, you didn't look closer. Eleanor's teacup, test it. The books around her chair, check their library stamps. The key under her garden gnome, what door does it open? Some secrets are buried deeper than bodies. Your friend, Chen's pulse quickened. The letter writer had specific knowledge about Eleanor's death scene, details that hadn't been made public. She retrieved the case file and crime scene photos, spreading them across her desk. In the photos, she could see Eleanor slumped peacefully in her favorite armchair, wearing her reading glasses, a book open in her lap. The teacup sat on the side table, still half full. The teacup had been cleaned and returned to Eleanor's kitchen after the scene was processed. Chen would need to track it down, though she doubted any useful evidence would remain after 6 months. The books, however, were another matter. They had been photographed in place before Eleanor's nephew had packed them away. Chen studied the crime scene photos with a magnifying glass. Around Eleanor's chair were stacks of books, mostly classics and mysteries. But now, looking more carefully, she noticed something odd. Several of the books appeared to be library books. But Eleanor had been the town librarian. Why would she have checked out books from her own library? The next morning, Chen visited the Millbrook Harbor Public Library. The building was a beautiful Victorian structure with tall windows and the musty smell of old books. The current librarian, James Morrison, had taken over after Eleanor's death. Eleanor often took books home, James explained, leading Chen through the stacks. She said she liked to read in her own space after being here all day. But you're right to notice something odd. He pulled out a thick ledger. Eleanor's checkout record shows she had 15 books out when she died, but her nephew only returned 12. What happened to the other 3? We assumed they were simply misplaced in the grief and cleanup. It happens sometimes. But now that you mention it, I remember thinking it was strange. Eleanor was meticulous about library property. Chen asked for the titles of the missing books. James flipped through his records. Let's see. The Art of Poison, Shadow of Death by Eleanor Herman, The Inheritor's Powder by Sandra Hempel, and The Borgias and Their Enemies by Christopher Hibbert. The detective felt a chill run down her spine. 3 books about poison, all missing from Eleanor's collection. She asked James to pull Eleanor's complete checkout history for the months leading up to her death. That's unusual, James said, scanning the records. Starting about 8 weeks before she died, Eleanor checked out dozens of books about toxicology, forensic science, and historical poisoning cases. She'd never shown interest in those subjects before. Chen left the library with photocopies of Eleanor's reading history and a growing certainty that the letter writer was leading her towards something significant. That evening, she drove to Eleanor's old house on Maple Street. The property had been inherited by Eleanor's nephew, David, who lived in California and had put it on the market. The house was a charming colonial with a wraparound porch and a garden that had grown wild in the months since Eleanor's death. Chen walked around the property, looking for the garden gnome mentioned in the letter. She found it near the back door, a cheerful ceramic figure holding a fishing rod. Sure enough, there was a key hidden underneath. Chen tried it in the back door, but it didn't fit. She tried the front door, the basement door, even the garden shed. Nothing. Then she noticed something she had missed before. A small root cellar door, nearly hidden by overgrown ivy. The key fit perfectly. Chen descended the narrow wooden steps into the root cellar, her flashlight illuminating stone walls and shelves lined with mason jars. But at the far end of the cellar, she found something that made her heart race. A small desk with a lamp, and spread across its surface were the three missing library books, along with handwritten notes in Eleanor's careful script. The notes were meticulous, almost scientific. Eleanor had been researching digitalis poisoning, drawn from the foxglove plants that grew wild around Millbrook Harbor. She had documented symptoms, dosages, and detection methods. But most disturbing were the personal notes. He thinks I don't know about the money. He thinks I'm just a foolish old woman. But I've seen the bank statements he carelessly left in his briefcase. My own nephew stealing from me for months. Chen photographed everything before carefully collecting the evidence. As she prepared to leave, she noticed one final detail. Eleanor's notes were written in the same precise Palmer method handwriting as the anonymous letters. The third letter arrived the next morning, and this time Chen was waiting for it. She had positioned herself across the street from the station at 3 a.m., watching. At 3:47 a.m., a figure in a dark coat approached the station. Chen couldn't make out the face, but she could see the slight limp mentioned by Margaret Hartwell. The letter was longer this time. Detective Chen, you found my secret room. Good. Now you know I was investigating my own nephew's theft. But you haven't found the most important evidence yet. David thought he was so clever, slipping the digitalis into my evening tea over the course of weeks. Small doses, building up in my system. It would look like a heart attack. Digitalis toxicity mimics cardiac arrest perfectly. But I documented everything. Check the loose floorboard under my desk in the cellar. I hid the real evidence there, along with a letter explaining everything. I knew David would come back for the money eventually. I wanted to make sure someone would know the truth. Eleanor, Chen's hands shook as she read. Eleanor had been writing to her from beyond the grave, leading her through the investigation step by step. The librarian had discovered her nephew's embezzlement and realized he was slowly poisoning her. But instead of confronting him or going to the police, Eleanor had methodically gathered evidence, knowing that her death would appear natural. Racing back to the house, Chen found the loose floorboard described in the letter. Underneath was a metal box containing Eleanor's final letter, photographs of bank statements showing David's theft, and most crucially, hair samples and fingernail clippings that Eleanor had collected from herself over the weeks she suspected she was being poisoned. The final letter from Eleanor was heartbreaking. To whoever finds this, my nephew David has been stealing from me for months, forging my signature on checks and withdrawing money from my accounts. When I discovered his theft, I confronted him. He laughed and said no one would believe a senile old woman. That night I began feeling ill after my evening tea. At first I thought it was just a stomach bug, but when the symptoms persisted and I recognized them from my research, I knew what David was doing. I am a librarian, Detective Chen. Research is what I do. I have documented everything. I know David thinks he's committed the perfect crime, but I've been writing letters to guide the investigation. I've been mailing them to myself with instructions for Mrs. Patterson next door to post them after my death. She thinks she's helping me with a mystery novel I'm writing. David doesn't know about the root cellar. I had it cleaned out and furnished after my husband died. It was my secret retreat. I hope you find the truth, Detective. I hope justice is served. Eleanor Whitmore. Chen sat in the dusty cellar, surrounded by the evidence of Eleanor's final investigation. The librarian had essentially solved her own murder, using her skills and methodical nature to ensure the truth would come out. Eleanor had even arranged for the letters to be mailed posthumously, turning her neighbor into an unwitting accomplice in exposing the crime. The arrest of David Whitmore made national news. The toxicology tests on Eleanor's hair and nail samples confirmed digitalis poisoning, and the bank records showed systematic theft over 8 months. David had been slowly draining his aunt's accounts while gradually poisoning her, believing that her death would appear natural and he would inherit her remaining estate. During the trial, David's defense attorney argued that Eleanor's posthumous letters were an elaborate hoax, but the evidence was overwhelming. The precise documentation, the physical evidence Eleanor had collected, and the testimony of Mrs. Patterson, who confirmed that Eleanor had asked her to mail the letters after her death as part of a mystery writing project. David was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The case became known as the librarian's last case, and Eleanor's story was featured in true crime documentaries and books. Detective Chen kept the final letter she received from Eleanor, mailed 2 weeks after the trial ended. Detective Chen, thank you for listening to an old woman's voice from beyond. Thank you for believing that even in death, the truth matters. David thought he could outsmart me because I was old and trusting, but he forgot that I spent 40 years helping people find answers to their questions. I simply applied those same skills to my own mystery. I hope my story helps others understand that no crime is perfect and no victim is powerless if they refuse to give up. Knowledge is the greatest weapon we have against injustice. Use it wisely. With gratitude, Eleanor Whitmore. Chen later learned that Eleanor had written and mailed dozens of letters before her death, timed to arrive at specific intervals. The final letter was mailed 6 months after her murder, ensuring that her voice would continue to guide the investigation long after she was gone. The case changed how the Millbrook Harbor Police Department handled sudden deaths in elderly residents. They now routinely check for signs of elder abuse and financial exploitation, and they always take a closer look when someone dies shortly after discovering they've been victimized. Eleanor's house was eventually sold, but the new owners kept the root cellar as she had left it, complete with the desk and lamp. They said it felt like a shrine to justice, and they couldn't bear to disturb it. The Millbrook Harbor Public Library established the Eleanor Whitmore Research Center, dedicated to helping community members research legal and financial matters. A plaque by the entrance reads, "In memory of Eleanor Whitmore, who proved that knowledge is power and that the truth always finds a way." On quiet nights when Detective Chen drives past the lighthouse on her way home, she thinks about Eleanor's methodical approach to her own murder investigation. The librarian had turned her final weeks into a carefully orchestrated plan to ensure justice would prevail, even in death. Sometimes, Chen reflects, the most powerful mysteries are solved not by brilliant deduction or dramatic confrontations, but by patient research, careful documentation, and the quiet determination of someone who refuses to let injustice have the last word. The midnight letters had stopped coming, but their message remained clear. The truth is always worth pursuing, no matter how much time it takes to find it. Story 3. The Velvet Curtain Murders. The neon lights of the Sapphire Lounge cast an eerie glow across the rain-soaked streets of downtown Phoenix on the night of March 3, 1994. Inside the upscale nightclub, the city's elite mingled over expensive cocktails, unaware that they were about to become witnesses to one of the most baffling murder cases in Arizona history. Victoria Chen had been the club's star performer for 3 years. Her sultry voice and commanding stage presence drew crowds from across the Southwest, and her weekend shows were always sold out. At 28, she had everything going for her: a recording contract in the works, a devoted following, and enough money saved to finally leave the nightclub scene behind. But Victoria had a secret that would ultimately cost her everything. The first sign of trouble came at 11:47 p.m., when the club's security cameras captured Victoria arguing with someone in the alley behind the building. The footage was grainy, the lighting poor, but investigators could make out two figures: Victoria in her signature red dress, and a taller person whose face remained hidden in the shadows. The conversation appeared heated, with Victoria gesturing emphatically before the unknown individual stepped closer. What happened next would haunt the investigators for years to come. The security camera malfunctioned for exactly 17 minutes, just long enough for Victoria to disappear. When the footage resumed, the alley was empty except for her red sequin purse lying open on the wet asphalt, its contents scattered by the wind. Detective Maria Santos was assigned to the case the following morning. A 15-year veteran of the Phoenix Police Department, Santos had seen her share of strange cases, but something about Victoria's disappearance felt different. There was no body, no ransom demand, no obvious motive. Victoria had no enemies that anyone knew of. Her finances were in order, and she had no history of erratic behavior. The investigation began with the club's staff and regular customers. The Sapphire Lounge attracted a diverse crowd: wealthy businessmen, local politicians, tourists, and entertainment industry professionals. Everyone seemed to have nothing but praise for Victoria. She was professional, punctual, and kept to herself between performances. The club's owner, Marcus Webb was particularly distraught. Victoria had been his biggest draw, and her disappearance was already affecting business. But as Detective Santos dug deeper, she began to uncover a web of secrets that stretched far beyond the glittering facade of the Sapphire Lounge. Victoria's apartment, a modest two-bedroom unit in Scottsdale, yielded the first real clue. Hidden behind a false back in her bedroom closet, Santos discovered a metal box containing $50,000 in cash, a forged passport under the name Elena Martinez, and most intriguingly, a series of photographs that would blow the case wide open. The photographs showed various patrons of the Sapphire Lounge in compromising situations, married politicians with their mistresses, business executives making what appeared to be illegal deals, and several images that suggested corruption within the city's government. Victoria hadn't just been a performer, she had been documenting the secret lives of Phoenix's power brokers. The breakthrough came when Santos discovered that Victoria had been meeting regularly with Thomas Brennan, an investigative journalist for the Arizona Republic. Brennan initially claimed he didn't know Victoria well, but when pressed, he admitted that she had been feeding him information about corruption in the city government. She had been planning to go public with her evidence, and several high-profile figures had a lot to lose if her story came to light. The list of suspects grew rapidly. There was City Councilman Richard Hawthorne, who had been photographed accepting what appeared to be bribes from construction companies. Developer Paul Richmond, who had been using his political connections to bypass environmental regulations. Even Police Captain Robert Mills, who had been providing protection for certain criminal enterprises in exchange for kickbacks. Each of these men had means, motive, and opportunity. Each had been at the Sapphire Lounge on the night Victoria disappeared, and each had something to gain from her silence. The case took a dramatic turn 2 weeks later when Victoria's body was discovered in the desert outside of Tucson, nearly 200 miles from Phoenix. She had been shot once in the head with a small caliber weapon, and her body showed signs of having been moved after death. The killer had tried to bury her in a shallow grave, but desert animals had partially uncovered the remains. The forensic evidence was limited but telling. Fibers found on Victoria's dress matched the interior of a luxury sedan, specifically a BMW 7 Series. The bullet that killed her came from a .22 caliber pistol, a relatively uncommon choice for professional criminals, but popular among wealthy individuals for personal protection. Most importantly, dirt samples from under her fingernails contained traces of a rare mineral found only in certain parts of the Sonoran Desert. Detective Santos methodically checked the alibis of all the suspects. Most claimed to have been at home with their families after leaving the club, but one story didn't add up. Police Captain Mills said he had gone straight home after the club closed, but his wife was visiting her sister in California that weekend. His BMW was in the shop for repairs, but the rental car agency confirmed he had rented a similar vehicle, a BMW 740i. The investigation revealed that Mills had been the most deeply involved in the corruption Victoria had uncovered. He had been taking payments from drug dealers, providing them with information about police raids and investigations. When Victoria threatened to expose him, he panicked. The night she disappeared, he had followed her into the alley and confronted her. When she refused to back down, he shot her and disposed of her body in the desert. The trial was a sensation in Phoenix. Mills maintained his innocence, claiming he was being framed by political enemies who wanted to deflect attention from their own corruption. But the evidence was overwhelming. The fibers, the rental car records, the ballistics match from a gun registered to Mills's wife, and testimony from other officers who had noticed his increasingly erratic behavior in the weeks following Victoria's disappearance. The case revealed the extent of corruption in Phoenix's government and led to a major investigation that brought down several other officials. Victoria's evidence, preserved in a safety deposit box that investigators found using a key hidden in her apartment, provided the proof needed to prosecute numerous cases of bribery, extortion, and abuse of power. Captain Robert Mills was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He died in prison 8 years later, never admitting to the crime but reportedly telling a cellmate that he had only meant to scare Victoria, not kill her. The Sapphire Lounge closed 6 months after Victoria's murder, unable to recover from the scandal and the loss of its star performer. The building now houses a family restaurant, And few people remember the glamorous nightclub that once attracted the city's elite. Victoria Chen's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of exposing corruption, but also a testament to the courage of those who risk everything to bring the truth to light. Her sacrifice led to meaningful reforms in Phoenix's government and helped restore some measure of trust between the police and the community they serve. Detective Santos, who retired 5 years after solving the case, still keeps a photograph of Victoria on her desk. Not the glamorous publicity shot from the club, but a candid picture found in Victoria's apartment, showing her laughing with friends at a backyard barbecue. It serves as a reminder that behind every victim is a human being with dreams, hopes, and the courage to stand up for what's right. The case of the Velvet Curtain murders, as it came to be known, remains one of the most significant corruption scandals in Arizona history. It demonstrated how one person's determination to expose the truth could bring down an entire network of powerful criminals, even at the ultimate cost. Years later, when asked about the case, Detective Santos would say that Victoria Chen was the real hero of the story. She had risked everything to shine a light on corruption and injustice, and though she paid with her life, her courage ensured that justice would ultimately prevail. In a city where power and money often trump truth and justice, Victoria Chen proved that sometimes the light of truth is stronger than the darkness of corruption. The Velvet Curtain murders serve as a reminder that evil often hides behind facades of respectability and power, but that there are always those brave enough to tear down those facades and expose the truth, no matter the cost. The Midnight Archivist. The autumn of 1987 brought with it an unusual chill to the coastal town of Millbrook Harbor. Nestled between rocky cliffs and endless stretches of Atlantic Ocean, this small Maine community had always prided itself on its peaceful nature. Crime was virtually non-existent, save for the occasional petty theft or public intoxication during the summer tourist season. That tranquility would be shattered on the night of October 15th, when Margaret Ashworth, the town's beloved librarian, vanished without a trace. Margaret had been a fixture in Millbrook Harbor for over 30 years. At 54, she lived alone in a modest cottage just 3 blocks from the library where she had worked since graduating from college. Every morning she would walk the same route to work, stopping at Henderson's Bakery for her usual coffee and blueberry muffin. She was known for her kind demeanor, her extensive knowledge of local history, and her habit of staying late at the library too. Story 4. The Silent Storm, the Unabomber's Shadow over America. His name was Ted Kaczynski, but for 17 years he was known only as the Unabomber. A ghost in the woods, a scholar with a vendetta against progress, and a criminal mastermind who left behind a trail of riddles, charred paper, and blood. This is not just a tale of violence. It's a story of obsession, solitude, and the eerie power of a single mind to bend the world to its will. As you drift off, imagine the rain washing away the noise. The thunder fades to a heartbeat rhythm, and somewhere in the dark, a typewriter clicks out a message that would change history. Part 1. The First Spark, 1978-1980. It began on May 25, 1978, at Northwestern University in Illinois. A package addressed to Professor Buck Buchanan sat unassumingly in a courtyard. Buchanan, a 38-year-old materials engineering professor, wasn't there to open it. Instead, a student picked it up, noticed a wisp of smoke, and dropped it. Moments later, the package exploded. Shrapnel tore into the student's hand. A fireball engulfed the courtyard. But the bomb's design was crude. No fingerprints, no clues. The FBI dubbed it the work of a lone bomber, but the case quickly went cold. Then silence. For 18 months, nothing. Until May 9, 1980, when another package arrived at the University of Illinois. This time, the recipient, Professor Robert Bishop, opened it. The explosion shattered his hands, leaving him permanently injured. The bomber had a pattern: target universities, attack professors in their fields, use primitive but effective bombs. But why? FBI agents scoured the fragments. The only clue was a handwritten note found in the debris. You are being watched. By 1982, the Unabomber's reach extended beyond academia. On December 11, a United Airlines flight from Denver to Chicago was diverted after a passenger noticed a strange clicking sound in the overhead bin. A bomb had detonated, but the plane landed safely. The device was a masterpiece of chaos. It used a barometer trigger designed to explode at 35,000 feet, but a flaw in the wiring had saved 150 lives. Investigators found a single fingerprint on the luggage tag. It didn't match any known criminal. The bomber had evolved. The 1980s were a nightmare of false leads and dead ends. The Unabomber struck 6 more times. 1983. A bomb at a Utah research lab injured a security guard. 1985. A computer store owner in California was killed by a mail bomb. 1987. A Sacramento newspaper office was bombed after publishing a letter mocking the killer. Each attack left behind a cryptic signature, a single page from a dictionary, often the word futility circled, a handwritten symbol, a jagged line resembling a mountain range, a note, "You are part of the system. You cannot escape." The FBI's behavioral science unit crafted a profile. Male, mid-30s to 50s. Highly intelligent, possibly with a STEM background. Obsessed with environmentalism and anti-technology themes. But the Unabomber was always one step ahead. By 1995, the Unabomber had eluded the FBI for 17 years. But his final act of terror was not a bomb. It was a 35,000-word manifesto titled Industrial Society and Its Future. The text arrived at the New York Times on June 24, 1995, with a chilling demand: publish the manifesto or the bombs would resume. The document was a manifesto of rage, blaming modern technology for humanity's loss of freedom. It argued that the Industrial Revolution had created a system of over-socialization, where people were forced to conform to societal norms. Excerpts included, "The revolutionaries should not expect to have a life of contentment. They must be willing to die or suffer hardship for their cause. The system does not and cannot exist for the benefit of the average person." The FBI was divided. Publishing the manifesto risked legitimizing the killer, but withholding it might lead to more deaths. In a controversial move, the Times and Washington Post jointly published the manifesto in September 1995. And then, a breakthrough. David Kaczynski, Ted's younger brother, recognized the manifesto's voice. The phrase over-socialization had appeared in Ted's letters from the 1970s. David confronted his parents. Ted had been a math prodigy at Harvard, a brilliant but reclusive mind who'd abandoned society in 1971, retreating to a cabin in the Montana wilderness. On April 3, 1996, FBI agents raided the cabin. They found handwritten drafts of the manifesto, bomb components, nails, wires, and pressure cookers. A journal detailing every attack since 1978. Ted Kaczynski was arrested without resistance. Kaczynski's trial was a media spectacle. He represented himself, arguing that the manifesto's ideas, not the bombings, were his true legacy. Prosecutors played audio of victims' screams. Defense attorneys argued insanity. In January 1998, Kaczynski pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty, receiving 4 life sentences without parole. But his final act of defiance was a letter to the court. "I do not renounce my beliefs. I will die with them." To understand the Unabomber, one must visit the place where he vanished, his cabin in Lincoln, Montana. In 1971, Ted Kaczynski abandoned his teaching post at the University of California, Berkeley, and retreated to a 10 by 14-foot shack he built with his own hands. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, a cot, and stacks of books on philosophy, mathematics, and survivalism. Neighbors described him as a hermit, a man who walked barefoot in winter and refused to speak. But in those 25 years of isolation, Kaczynski's mind sharpened into a weapon. His journals from this period reveal a descent into obsession. "The system is a machine. It grinds people into parts. I will dismantle it one cog at a time. Pain is the only language they understand." It was here that he built his first bombs, testing them in the woods, learning to make them silent, precise, and deadly. The Unabomber's mind was a paradox. FBI profilers called him a mission-oriented lone wolf, a killer driven not by greed or psychosis, but by ideology. Dr. Sally Johnson, a forensic psychologist who interviewed Kaczynski, noted, "He wasn't a madman, he was a logician. Every attack was a lesson, every bomb a lecture." Kaczynski's manifesto accused modern society of stripping humans of autonomy. He saw technology as a parasite, feeding on freedom. His bombs were designed not just to kill, but to send a message. You are complicit. Yet his own contradictions haunted him. He relied on the postal system to deliver bombs. He used stolen tools to build them. He wrote his manifesto on a typewriter, a product of the very industrial system he despised. The Unabomber's reign left scars deeper than flesh. His attacks reshaped how America viewed mail, universities, and even the concept of terrorism. Mail security was revolutionized. Universities installed bomb-sniffing dogs. Airlines adopted stricter screening. The term lone wolf entered the national lexicon, influencing counterterrorism strategies for decades. His manifesto became a touchstone for anti-tech extremists, inspiring copycats and conspiracy theorists. But his greatest legacy may be the ethical debate he sparked. Should the media publish terrorist propaganda? Can a killer's ideas be separated from their crimes? Today, Kaczynski's manifesto lives on in online forums and conspiracy theories. His cabin, confiscated by the FBI, was destroyed in 2010 to prevent it from becoming a shrine. The Unabomber's legacy is a paradox. A man who hated technology but used it to terrorize, who sought to destroy the system but became its most infamous prisoner. As you drift off, imagine the rain slowing to a hush, the thunder retreating into silence, and somewhere a typewriter's final keystroke fades into the dark. So close your eyes. Let the hush of the night wrap around you. And know this: some stories don't end. They drift as they dream. They wait for you to listen again. Good night.